Dracula. All right, we're going to continue reading Dracula. I read 8 pages yesterday. All right, so he's just now getting to the Count's place of residence. He was on a coach there, going through the mountainside. A lot of people just keep crossing themselves and praying. So we're on page 8. The one thing about this book that I will say, the sentences, it's descriptive. It's very descriptive, trying to set the scene and the setting, but the sentences can be long, which can get you lost. Like, bro, what are we talking about here? All right. Yeah, I read this part, but I'm gonna just keep going. So page 8. I read 8 pages yesterday. Whew. Try to get through a couple more pages today. All right. As we wound our in the English is, I mean, he lived, I'm not sure when this book was published, but he died in 1912. So yeah. As we wound on our endless way and the sun sank lower and lower behind us, the shadows of the evening began to creep around us. This was emphasized by the fact that the snowy mountaintops still held the sunset and seemed to glow out with a delicate, cool pink. Here and there we passed Czechs and Slovaks, all in picturesque attire, but I noticed that, this is the word I didn't know, Goitre, Goiter, was painfully prevalent. By the roadside there were many crosses. As we swept by, my companions all crossed themselves. Here and there was a peasant man or woman kneeling before a shrine, who did not even turn round as we approached, but seemed in the self-surrender of devotion to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world. There are many things new to me. For instance, hay ricks in the trees, and here and there, very beautiful masses of weeping birch, their white stems shining like silver through the delicate green of the leaves. Now and again we passed a later wagon, the ordinary peasant's cart, with its long snake-like vertebrae, calculated to suit the inequalities of the road. On this were sure to be seated quite a group of homecoming peasants, the Czechs with their white and the Slovaks with their colored sheepskins, the latter carrying lance fashion, their long staves with axe at the end. As the evening fell, it began to get very cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness, the gloom of the trees, oak, beech, and pine, though in the valleys which ran deep between the spurs of the hills as we ascended through the pass. The dark firs stood out here and there against the background of the late-lying snow. You see how long that sentence was? One more time. This is how long this sentence is. As the evening fell, it began to get very cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness through the glooms of the trees, oak, beech, and pine, though in the valleys which ran deep between the spurs of the hills, as we ascended through the pass, the dark firs stood out here and there against the background of the late-lying snow. Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine woods that seemed in the darkness to be closing down upon us, great masses of grayness, which here and there bestrewed the trees, produced a peculiarly weird and solemn effect, which carried on the thoughts and grim fancies engendered earlier in the evening. When the falling sunset threw into the strange relief the ghost-like clouds, which among the Carpathians seemed to wind ceaselessly through the valleys. Sometimes the hills were so steep that, despite our driver's haste, the horses could only go slowly. I wished to get down and walk up them, as we do at home, but the driver would not hear of it. No, no, he said, you must not walk here. The dogs are too fierce. And then he added, with what he evidently meant for grim pleasantry, for he looked round to catch the approving smile of the rest, and you may have enough of such matters before you go to sleep. The only stop he would make was a moment's pause to light his lamps. When it grew dark, there seemed to be some excitement amongst the passengers, and it kept speaking to him, one after the other, as though urging him to further speed. He lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip and with wild cries of encouragement, urged them on to further exertions. Then through the darkness, I could see a sort of patch of gray light ahead of us, as there were a cleft in the hills. The excitement of the passengers grew greater. The crazy coach rocked on its great leather springs and swayed like a boat tossed on a stormy sea. I had to hold on. The road grew more level, and we appeared to fly along. Then the mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side and to frown down upon us as we were entering on the Borgo Pass. One by one, several of the passengers offered me gifts, which they pressed upon me with a earnestness which would take no denial. These were certainly of an odd and varied kind, but each was given in simple good faith, with a kindly word and a blessing, and that strange mixture of fear-meaning movements which I had seen outside the hotel at Bistritz. The sign of the cross and the guard against the evil eye. Then, as we flew along, the driver leaned forward and on each side of the passengers, craning over the edge of the coach, peered eagerly into the darkness. It was evident that something very exciting was either happening or expected. But though I asked each passenger, no one would give me the slightest explanation. This state of excitement kept on for some little time, and at last we saw before us the pass opening out on the eastern side. There were dark, rolling clouds overhead, and in the air the heavy, oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had separated two atmospheres, and that now we had got into the thunderous one. I was now myself looking out for the conveyance which was to take me to the Count. Each moment I expected to see the glare of lamps through the blackness, but all was dark. The only light was the flickering rays of our own lamps, which the steam from our hard-driven horse rolled in a white cloud. We could see now the sandy road lying white before us, but there was on it no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness, which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I had best do, when the driver, looking at his watch, said to the others something which I could hardly hear. It was spoken so quietly and in so low of a tone, I thought it was an hour less than the time. Then turning to me, he said in German, worse than my own, "There is no carriage here. The Herr, Herr, is not expected after all. He will now come on to Bukovina and return tomorrow or the next day. Better the next day." Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants and a universal crossing of themselves, a calichet with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps, as the rays fell on them, that the horses were coal black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight as he turned to us. He said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend," the man stammered in reply. The English Herr was in a hurry to reach, the stranger replied. "That is why, I suppose, you wished him to go on to Bukovina. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much and my horses are swift." As he spoke, he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth as white as ivory. One of my companions was to another line from Burgers Lenore, Den die Toten retten schnell, for the dead travel fast. "You are early tonight, my friend." The English Herr was in a hurry To which the stranger replied, "That is why I wish them to go on to Bukovina." The stranger evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a gleaming smile. The passenger turned his face away, at the same time putting out 2 fingers and crossing himself. "Give me the hare's luggage," said the driver, and with exceeding alacrity, my bags were handed out and put in the calash. Then I descended from the side of the coach, and as the calash was close alongside, the driver helped me with a hand which caught my arm in a grip out of steel. The driver helping me with a hand which caught my arm in a grip of steel. His strength must have been prodigious. Without a word, he shook his reins, the horses turned, and we swept into the darkness of the pass. As I looked back, I saw the stream of the horses of the coach by the light of the lamps and projected it against the figures of my late companions crossing themselves. Then the driver cracked his whip and called to his horses, and off they swept on their way to Bukovina. As they sank into the darkness, I felt a strange chill, and a lonely feeling came over me. But a cloak was thrown over my shoulders and a rug across my knees, and the driver said in excellent German, "The night is chill, mein Herr, and my master the Count bade me to take all care of you. There's a flask of Slivovitz, the plum brandy of the country, underneath the seat, if you should require it." I did not take any, but it was a comfort to know it was there all the same. I felt a little strangely and not a little frightened. I think had there been any alternative, I should have taken it instead of prosecuting that unknown night journey. The carriage went at a hard pace straight along. Then we made a complete turn and went along another straight road. It seemed to me we were simply going over and over the same ground again. And so I took a note of some salient point and found that this was so. I would have liked to have asked the driver what this all meant, but I really feared to do so, for I thought that, placed as I was, any protest would have had no effect in case there had been an intention to delay. Okay, so basically the driver is driving in circles, and he was like, "Well, let me see." It felt like he was driving in circles, so he's like, "Let me see if this." So he picked up a point, and he's like, "Okay, we are driving in circles." No event in case there had been an intention to delay. By and by, however, as I was curious to know how time was passing, I struck a match, and by its flame looked at my watch. It was within a few minutes of midnight. This gave me a sort of shock, for I suppose the general superstition about midnight was increased by my recent experiences. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense. So the lady told him, before he got on the carriage, the lady told him that he should probably wait a day because it's the night of St. George's or something like that, and all the evil stuff is coming out. So that's why he's scared about midnight. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in a farmhouse far down the road, a long, agonized wailing as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another, and another, till, borne on the wind which now sighed softly through the pass, a wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp it through the gloom of the night. At the first howl, the horses began to strain and rear, but the driver spoke to them soothingly, and they quieted down, but shivered and sweated as though after a runaway from sudden fright. Then, far off in the distance, from the mountains on each side of us, began a louder and a sharper howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way, for I was minded to jump from the calash and run, whilst they reared again and plunged madly, so that the driver had to use all his great strength to keep them from bolting. In a few minutes, however, my own ears got accustomed to the sound, and the horses so far became quiet that the driver was able to descend and to stand before them. He petted and soothed them, and whispered something in their ears, as I've heard of horse tamers doing, and with extraordinary effect, for under his caress, they became quite manageable again, though they still trembled. The driver again took his seat and, shaking his reins, started off at a great pace. This time, after going to the far side of the pass, he suddenly turned down a narrow roadway which ran sharply to the right. Soon we were hemmed in with the trees, which in places arched right over the roadway till we passed as through a tunnel. And again, great frowning rocks guarded us boldly on either side. Though we were in shelter, we could hear the rising wind, for it moaned and whistled through the rocks, and the branches of the trees crashed together as we swept along. It grew colder and colder still, and fine powdery snow began to fall, so that soon we and all around us were covered in a white blanket. The keen wind still carried the howling of the dogs, though this grew fainter as we went on our way. The baying of the wolves sounded nearer and nearer, as though we were closing round on us on every side. I grew dreadfully afraid, and the horses shared my fear. The driver, however, was not in the least disturbed. He kept turning his head left and right, but I could not see anything through the darkness. Suddenly, away on our left, I saw a faint flickering blue flame. The driver saw it at the same moment. He at once checked the horses and, jumping to the ground, disappeared into the darkness. I did not know what to do. The less as the howling of the wolves grew closer, but while I was wondering, the driver suddenly appeared again, and without a word took his seat and resumed our journey. I think I must have fallen asleep and kept dreaming of the incident, for it seemed to be repeated endlessly. And now looking back, it is like a sort of awful nightmare. Once the flame appeared so near the road that even in the darkness around us, I could watch the driver's motions. He went rapidly to where the blue flame arose. It must have been very faint, for it did not seem to illumine the place around it at all. And gathering a few stones, formed them into some device. Once there appeared a strange optical effect. When he stood between me and the flame, he did not obstruct it, for I could see a ghostly flicker all the same. This startled me, but as the effect was only momentary, I took it that my eyes deceived me, straining through the darkness. Then for a time, there were no blue flames, and we sped onwards through the gloom, with the howling of the wolves around us, as though they were following in a moving circle. At last there came a time when the driver went further afield than he had yet gone, and during his absence, the horses began to tremble worse than ever and to snort and scream with fright. I could not see any cause for it, for the howling of the wolves had ceased altogether. But just then the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of a beetling pine-clad rock, and by its light I saw around us a ring of wolves with white teeth and lolling red tongues, with long, sinewy limbs and shaggy hair. They were 100 times more terrible in the grim silence which held them than even when they howled. For myself, I felt a sort of paralysis of fear. It is only when a man feels himself face to face with such horrors that he can understand their true import. All at once, the wolves began to howl as though the moonlight had some peculiar effect on them. The horses jumped about and reared and looked helplessly round with eyes that rolled in a painful way to see. But the living ring of terror encompassed them on every side, and they had been perforce to remain within it. I called to the coachman to come, for it seemed to me that our only chance was to try to break out through the ring and to aid his approach. I shouted and beat the side of the calash, hoping by the noise to scare the wolves from that side, so as to give him a chance of reaching the trap. How he came there, I know not, but I heard his voice raised in a tone of imperious command, and looking towards the sound saw him stand in the roadway. As he swept his long arms, as though brushing aside some impalpable obstacle, the wolves fell back and back further still. Just then a heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon, so that we were again in darkness. When I could see the driver was climbing into the calash and the wolves had disappeared, When I could see again, the driver was climbing into the cattle and the wolves had disappeared. This was all so strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me, and I was afraid to speak or move. The time seemed interminable as we swept on our way, now in almost complete darkness, for the rolling clouds obscured the moon. We kept on ascending with occasional periods of quick descent, but in the main always ascending. Suddenly, I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlement showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky. Chapter 1. All right, chapter 1. He finally made it to the castle. Chapter 1, he finally made it to the castle. Now we're on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is on page 15, and it starts with May 5th. Chapter 2 starts on page 15, starts on May 5th. He finally made it to the castle. So on his way there to the castle, he finally left the coach with all the rest of the passengers, and then they're going up through the mountains. The wolves come around him, but he can't see the wolves. All he hears is howling. And then, I don't know why that joint weird, right? The person driving the whatchamacallit keep getting out and leaving him in there with the horses. And then next thing you know, when it's finally quiet, and then the moon come out because it's dark. And then as soon as the clouds go past the moon, he can see. He don't hear no wolves no more, and there's wolves all around him. And he like, oh shit. They're not howling no more, they all around him. And the horses don't know what to do. The horses like, it's wolves all around us, and the horses just like, oh shit. And then I don't know why the driver keep leaving him like that. The driver keeps stopping, leaving him, stopping and leaving him. It's weird. But he finally made it to the castle. All right, that's chapter 1. I can only imagine what's going to happen in chapter 2.